So, welcome to the Perfectly Flawed podcast. For those that don't know you, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Patrick Fisher. I'm the principal psychologist at P3 Performance Psychology. I also do some counseling psychology. Previously to that, I spent 12 years as a coach and director all throughout Swimming Australia. And across that time period, really became passionate about psychology. I think most people have spent time in sport, understand the value of mental skills, both from performance and a mental health perspective. Um, and so I developed and became a psychologist and really want to give back, particularly to the sporting community, but definitely to the broader community. And so super excited to talk to you today because I think this podcast is a really valuable idea in talking more openly, particularly in the sporting community, about psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, and I don't think it's spoken about enough. So, hopefully, this gives that platform to open that conversation up.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you just said, I think there's a big even mystery to what psychology even is and how we use it and how we could engage and what the benefits are and what that looks like. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about all of those things, right, as we go through.
Absolutely. So, obviously, like you're interested in psychology and sport. How did you get into that? Like, what was the main drive to start this?
Yeah, really good question. So it was a long time ago. I think, I was an assistant coach back in Sydney, 2008. And it was really clear to me, even from that position, that we had access to, the best exercise physiologists, physiotherapists, biomechanics, we use the term support staff integration. We could really get, everything that we needed to help athletes be their best holistically. But the gap was psychology. We didn't have access to psychologists, and then psychologists, hopefully I don't say this disrespectfully to the industry, but then the psychologists that we did get often just didn't understand the context of high performance sport or of swimming and the structures that were difficult. So for me, as an assistant coach at that time in a program that didn't have a lot of resources, my thinking was I needed, professional development as a coach. And I thought, and I still think this will probably circle back, but I'll go and upskill in psychology and I'll provide that as a coach. That was how I really got started. And then over that period of studying psychology and then working in psychology, developed a passion where I said, hey, instead of just working with my own program and my own athletes, I can take this broader and have a bigger impact, right? Which is how I
Absolutely.
which is how I got into it. And I still think, I suppose, to cycle to that, I still think the biggest impact we can have in psychology is with coaches, right? Coaches are there every day. If you're on the national stream, whether it's an age group I'm talking specifically swimming here, which is mostly my background, but if you're on the age group stream or the open stream, you're training generally in the 4 to 5 hours a day. So giving people that lead and develop that environment with the fundamental psychology knowledge to build the mental skills of their athletes, both for life and sport, I think is where the biggest impact can happen. So that's most of the work that we do, but of course we work with individual athletes as well. So that's a long answer to how I got psychology.
No, that's awesome. And I think particularly what you said, and there's always physios and the physical aspect, that support is there. And I think we talk about it a lot, sports a mental game. I think that sentence alone is brought up a lot, but we don't actually delve into it any further than that. It's just that statement.
I agree so much. And isn't it interesting, right? We go, sport's a mental game. And I say, well, what are we doing for that part of the game, right? And normally we get blank faces, right? We're not doing it. And then we even talk, at each transitional level, right? You can even go from, the 16-year-old age group athlete to the 18-year-old starting to make that transition to seniors to, I'll say sub elite and then elite. Each of those transitions is a very clear mental step, right?
Yeah,
And what are we doing to support that mental step? And the answer is not a lot right now. And then we kind of have to delve into why, right? I think that's the really interesting, not just, hey, throw our hands in the air and kick and scream that it's not happening. A big reason is that, as psychology is in an industry, within sport, we haven't been able to articulate the value well enough, and we haven't been able to show people and be there with people to say, hey, this is what it looks like and these are the benefits. And so I think that's an important step in being able to do that.
Absolutely. And I think even now, just mental health in general has sort of been spoken about a little bit more. So it'll be interesting to see how that conversation translates into sport over the next few years.
It will be. And of course, there's been a lot of acceleration in, I say, the destigmatization, right, of mental health probably in the last 10 years. But working in the field, particularly in sport, I say sport is probably still another 10 years behind that. Right? And you definitely see some of, the bigger sports. We say the AFL is one of note for me, who have mandated psychologists to be part of teams. So there's some good kind of systemic strategies and interventions happening, which is great. But the thing that I still see consistently is most people saying, we're supportive of mental health. We want to be doing, the right things and putting the right processes in place until it's the individual who's struggling. And then it's, I don't want to see a psychologist. I don't need that help, which to me is the clear sign that stigma is still there, right? I support mental health and mental health is important until it's me. And then I don't want people to know and I don't want to have to address it. And so I think, once we get to a point where people can openly go, the same way I have a shoulder niggle, right? Same way I have a hip niggle, I've got, whatever else is going on in life, I need to go and speak to someone. I think that's where we need to get to.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So what does a day in the life of a performance psych look like? What is it that you do?
Yeah, good question. Can be broad. And I suppose we use the mental health continuum. Again, I kind of simplify some processes and some of the psych industry won't like me doing that, but I think it's part of getting our message out, right? Is that we have, from psychology on the far end, we have high performers, right? So we have people who potentially are very mentally healthy, right? And huge resilience, mentally strong, not to say that doesn't fluctuate in itself, right? As we know that it does, but psychology still has value to those, and probably more value to those people and athletes in trying to continually get those 1% improvement, right? Because at the elite level, that's what it is. And most of that improvement is in psychology, is in mental skills. You've spent generally by that time, if you're at that level, 10 years plus perfecting your craft, right? Whether that's your physiology, your biomechanics, your S&C. A lot of people haven't spent any time on the mental side, right? And so if you want those quick improvements, that's potentially where they are for all the time. There's a great performance psych, Michael Gervais, who explains it as you have, your craft, and yourself, and which do you need to master, right? And so we would say mastery of self becomes before mastery of craft, right? You really can't truly master what you want to be good at until you've mastered yourself. What does that mean? Are you aware of the things that drive you? Are you aware of the barriers? Do you have strategies to deal with them? So that's the high performance end. And most of my work sits in that area across individual athletes, coaches, and teams. All right. So most come to us and say, we want to use mental skills to improve our performance. And now at some point within that, there's always a well-being conversation, and there are always conversations about balance. That come along with that. Of course, they are fundamental. On the other end, of course, we have the mental health side. All right. And so that is, athletes who are normal people, which sometimes gets forgotten, who are struggling, who have, and a lot of the times, I'd say a small amount of the time, those struggles can be a part of the journey of elite sport, but a lot of the time it's outside of life, right? And it starts to impact sport, and that's where then they start to look for help from us, which is normal from psychology, right? It's a combination of, social and transitional and psychological and behavioral always. And so a smaller amount of my work, but it's definitely a key part of my work, is in making sure people who engage with us are mentally healthy and have the support that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is interlinked, which I mean is great that everything works together. But if one thing falls apart, it tends to be a domino effect that everything else starts to slide as well.
Agree 100%. And I think even more so, I would even take it a step further in that most often it's not just one thing, right? It's a one thing and it's a domino. But actually, when we take a step back and we really look, there's a series of things that are hard or difficult or, that have been piled on top. And maybe that there's, one moment that makes it really tough and starts that domino. But when we actually take a step back and have a look, it's, hey, you've got all of these things going on in life right now. And so it makes absolute sense that it's tough and we're struggling right now, right?
Yeah.
Like that's I think, and one of the big values of psychology is being able, and I'm sure, anyone who's engaged with a psychologist knows, is that it's that normalization, right? Most
Yeah.
people think it's, I'm struggling, I shouldn't be struggling with this, particularly in sport. I'm resilient, I'm tough, I need to have these things. But to be able to come in and say, no, actually, everything that's going on in your life right now means it should be really hard. And maybe let's talk about some strategies to get us through this tough period and then back on track.
Yeah. So going off what you just said there, in the sense that, this shouldn't, like, why am I struggling? Like, I shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Do you think that comes from sport itself? Is that there is sort of a stigma in sport that as an athlete, you have to be mentally tough to get through the training and the schedule and everything that sport is? Do you think there is that stigma that stops people from going to get help?
That is one of those questions that I'm going to give a classic psych answer here. It's one that sounds simple, but is really complex. And so the way I suppose I'll try to simplify it is that no matter who we are, based on the environments that we grow up in and that we're a part of, we develop ways of thinking. We develop, over time, really strongly held beliefs about the way we respond to certain situations, right? And most of the time, those strongly held beliefs are adaptive in a certain situation. All right. And so in this situation, and we kind of talk about something like the idea of unrelenting standards, like I have really strong standards that I should be able to meet. And whether we put that as in, I'm an athlete that can cope with anything and is tough and resilient. And I have rules and etc., which is something we definitely see with nearly every athlete that we speak to, right?
Yeah.
That is required for high level performance, right? But it can develop into too strong of a belief, right? And it can also develop into a belief where it becomes, like we've just said, maladaptive in other situations in life. So when we take that mentality away and we start to take it on a bit of, as our identity, right, is that I should be this person all the time. That's where it starts to become an issue. And that's where, again, in psychology, it's not necessarily about, this all or one stigma, but it's about where does, a thought pattern or a behavioral pattern work and is good and is adaptive, and then where is it not? And being able to clearly identify that. And we kind of get into then, more frameworks, and a big one that kind of links there is the idea of psychological flexibility, right? So I'm able to decide what is best for me based on the context, right?
Yeah.
And so with mental toughness in particular, I suppose as we go through, let's even talk granular at a sport level. Mental toughness is great for the training that needs to happen and the commitment and the self-discipline. We know really clearly from the literature, mental toughness can be a barrier from returning from injury, right? You tend to want to push too hard, you tend to not want to take time off, and you tend to extend that injury and potentially make it more than it is. So there's always interesting complexities, right? The idea of we should be more vulnerable, yes, but when and when not, right? When do we have to be honest with ourselves and be like, hey, it's time to be tough here, right? And
Yeah.
when can we step back and say, actually, I need to be vulnerable and talk, and there's things going on. And I think that links to then even broader ideas of, can I be someone who is tough and strong and resilient, but have weak moments? Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, of course you can, right? And vice versa, right? And so I suppose to wrap all that up, the idea is that we don't box, right? It's not we're trying to be mentally tough or we're not trying to be mentally tough. It's really contextual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I was to ask like a random person in the community, what kind of characteristics would you say an athlete has? And I think the typical responses would be strong, tough, resilient, all those things. But I also think that when you put those on, that's not just physical, that's mental too, as you were saying, like being mentally tough. But then it's also the way the media portrays an athlete to be. And as soon as they show a different side, it's like, in quotations, a bad thing. Like they shouldn't be doing that. But they're also human. Like they have a broad range of emotions. They're a human being just like everybody else. Just because they're an athlete doesn't mean they're not human.
Absolutely. I
Right?
think that's so great. Yeah, absolutely. Because the first thing when you said that question, when the general public would ask me, what are the characteristics of an athlete? The answer is the same characteristics as everybody else,
Yeah.
right? Realistically, that's the answer. You're 100% right.
So what kind of, I guess, on that, what kind of impact do you think social media plays in, I guess, the stigma and the way that we should be? And then even to the point of like comparing yourself to other people.
Yeah, again, a classic psych answer, very, very complex response. And I suppose the first and I think the most truthful answer is we don't really know. And I think we need to be really clear on that we don't fully know yet the impact of social media. We're seeing obviously some different aspects, both positive and negative, and I think that's important to say, of social media. But really, at a research level, at a data level, it's too early for us to say, right, what are these impacts? But when we take a step back and look broader, the same way we just kind of spoke about athletes and strength and resilience and unrelenting standards, the environment is also conducive to wanting admiration and being recognition seeking and comparing with others, right? We want to limit that to a degree, but that is part of the environment. And wanting to win and wanting that recognition is something that you can't really shy away from, right? But
Yeah.
it's keeping it in context always. And so obviously social media, then putting that in, adds another level to that, right? It's that, now we can get all of this recognition, we can get even more recognition, we can get it young. One I speak to a lot of people about in swimming all the time is, we're seeing a lot now of, sponsorships that happen for young age groupers, right? Like between, down to 11, I think is kind of the youngest I've seen. And now they're getting recognition on social media. And so will that again drive an environment that is at least makes it more likely for that individual to seek recognition from others and gain excessive amounts of value from that? Of course, right? Does that mean it will happen for everybody? Of course not. There are other environmental factors as always. But social media is an interesting one. And I think the idea of recognition seeking and comparing with others is a really interesting one in the sporting environment, because again, like unrelenting standards and toughness, it is something that's okay. It's just, as with anything, in moderation.
Yeah. And it's so hard. And I think even to with the sponsorships, I think then, if you're looking at social media in particular, you get more followers and more likes, but it also opens you up to more criticism, because there are people online that can be really harsh, and especially at a young age, that can have a really big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think one of the important things that we'll often try to teach people, regardless of whether they come to us for performance or mental health, is this idea, and we kind of spoke about it a little bit before, that others feel the same as what we feel, right?
Yeah.
That's generally, again, one of the big normalizing. People come in, it's like, everybody else is doing so well and I'm struggling and I'm not handling, and it's like, no, more than likely, if anybody was in your situation, they would feel the same, right?
Yeah.
And then putting that in context, in a couple of ways. The first way, from a performance anxiety perspective, right, is, hey, everybody in the race generally probably feels the same amount of nerves and anxiety you feel, right? And not basing then your race plan off, right? Because others will have, for example, an anxiety response where they throw the race plan out the window and decide they're just going to go on the first 50 of a 400, right? and if you don't realize that they're feeling that, and they're taking out a race too quickly and being able to stay, in your own lane, it's going to impact your race, right? And it's the same thing with social media, being able to step back and go, hey, I'm getting all this negativity, but understanding where it's coming from their perspective, that ability to nearly empathize with those people, like what's going on for them, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
there's something going on for them, is a really strong position to be able to be in, to not let those things affect you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I listened to a podcast, The Imperfects, with the Resilience Project, and they talked to a guy called Ben Crow, and I'm sure there's a few people that have heard of him. And the way that he spoke with Ash Barty and some of the interviews that she's done, and a lot of the questions that they said that she gets asked is, how do you deal with other people's expectations and the pressure? And she goes, well, what pressure?
Mm.
Because otherwise I'm thinking about things that are out of my control. Like I
Absolutely.
can't control their expectations of me. If I've done the hard work, then that's the result I'll get. The only expectations of pressure is from me, not from anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much, because I would agree. Most people come to us at some point and it's, their initial goals are, to a degree, they might have other things, but somewhere within it is, I want to be able to deal with high pressure situations and high stress situations and still perform when I feel that. And we definitely don't start with that, because you've got to take people on the journey, right? So, but in the essence, there are no high pressure situations. There are no high stress situations. There's just one moment and the next moment. And in those moments, where are we focusing our attention? Where is our awareness? What is our ability to control the things that are in control? And how do we anchor to the things that actually matter to us? Right? And if we can do that and learn, and it's a skill that we can learn, then exactly as you just described, there's no pressure. There's just the things that Ash is trying to execute, right? And
Yeah.
her ability to focus on that. And that's absolutely a core foundation of performance psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. So to strip this all the way back,
Mm.
who and when should see a sports psych? Or just a psych in general? Like who should be those
Yeah.
people and when would you say that should happen?
Nearly feels like a sales pitch here. I want to say everybody, um, and I want to say that honestly, everybody. And I suppose we can kind of break down how that would look, right? So the first thing I kind of describe is, and we've said this before, we do really clear, particularly in swimming. Some sports aren't always as mature, but if you turn up to any program in Australia, there's going to be half an hour before the session of prehab, um, S&C work, making sure we're doing the things to keep our bodies healthy, right, for the session. And I have a real belief that psychology should be involved in that. There should be a mental skills component in that that's proactive, right? So we're not waiting until there's an issue. And the way I describe it is, you don't put 200 kilos on a back squat, get someone to squat to the bottom, and then start teaching them how to squat out of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we do with mental health a lot of the time, and really when we look at it from that perspective, it's, of course it's hard, right? And of course a lot of people, then that becomes a lifelong process, right? So for me, the perspective is, why don't we teach these strategies first, so when the life stresses come, we're already able to deal with it, right? We do that for everything else, for racing, for training, for physio. I think mental skills should sit there. So that would be my first thing. I think everybody. How would you do that? We're still in a place where just having everybody come in for individual sessions, we're not there yet, right? Of course. So is it group sessions, right? Is it one team session once a month, or once every 3 months, or once every quarter, or just starting that process? Is it just coaching sessions where coaches are getting some of the basic tools that they can take and build in, right? Physios aren't there every day. Right? Psychologists don't need to be either. So I think that's the first thing, and I think you could make such an impact by having that strategy, right? Of course, then we get into, when are people struggling and not seeking help that they should? That again is a difficult question. I would say, as soon as you feel like you need support, you should be able to reach out, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very broad thing again. I suppose to be in the very kind of clinical psych world is, when is it starting to have an impact on multiple areas of your life? Is kind of that classic cue where we should definitely be seeking individual help at that point. So it comes back to my first answer, I suppose, is everybody, right? And when, I just think now.
Yeah.
I think the benefit is there. But as I've said, I think as psychologists in the industry still, particularly in the sport environment, we still need to do better at articulating how those relationships can start and what it would look like. And I don't think it looks specifically like traditional psychology looks like, with people coming into the clinic and doing our 1 hour consult once a week. Not to say that that's not valuable in some situations, but particularly in the sporting environment, it's how do we build it into the daily training environment? That's where we need to get to.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think I didn't realize the impact until I was exposed to it myself. But once you start doing it, you're like, why did I not do this earlier? Like, why,
Yeah.
why is this another thing? Like, you know, if you're going into a race, you tend to go get a massage from the physio to make sure that your body's ready. Why do we not do the same thing mentally? Like, you need to be mentally ready for a race. Why are we not doing the same sort of preparation?
Yeah, I agree. And it's a fascinating insight. Exactly the way you described. Every athlete, you know, really that I've ever worked with has said that. Was like, I don't know why we waited. You know, I wish we had access to this earlier. But I think to follow up on the point about, you know, coming into race preparation, most people, once they take that step to start, that actually is really clear to them that, hey, you know, I want to stand behind, you know, we'll say a block swimming, but it could be I want to be at the beginning of my race, whatever it is that is important to me, and I want to feel prepared, right? Everybody knows that, and traditionally we've thought about that as fully prepared, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are now recognizing that I'm no way close to mentally prepared. I don't know what to expect. I don't know what to do with certain. The honest truth is, most people, to a degree, you know, don't even know what emotions and thoughts they're having in the moment. You know, don't know what those thoughts or emotions mean. Don't know where they come from. Don't know, for a lot of the point, that we actually don't even have to do anything with them, right? Because it's the idea of worrying about worry itself is kind of the big thing. Understanding that, hey, the things that we have going on, they're absolutely okay. They're not going anywhere. They're part of the environment. How do we refocus? You know, at Ash Barty, how do we refocus on what's important to us? And so I agree, you know, that idea of being as mentally prepared as we are physically is a big opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of being mentally prepared, how would you, I mean, we'll talk about swimming because both have that sort of background.
Yep.
How would you go into a race? Like, what would you recommend, like going into marshalling, standing behind the blocks? What would you suggest to be mentally prepared?
Such a good question, and such a broader question. The first thing I would say is, I always put it in context of, you know, because everybody's really clear on biomechanics and skills and physiology. So the first thing I would say is, would we ever go into a major meet and be trying, you know, new skill work, new drill work in the warm up, trying a race plan that we've never used before? Nobody would ever do that, right? We know that is not the place. Like, we train for, you know, generally our plans are 16 to 24 weeks, depending on what's going on. You know, to know what we're doing, for there to be no changes, for it to be automatic, right? So the first thing I would say is, if you come to me and you want to know what do I do on race day, I'm going to say, well, actually, what do we need to do 16 weeks before that?
Yeah.
You know, because the honest truth is, it's not impossible. And we recently had athletes, like we just had Australian Nationals, which is different this year, not being Olympic trials. So what is it? Australian Championships. It's a weird meet this year. Where we did have a couple athletes call who hadn't engaged before and wanted that answer, right? Hey, I've had a meet the first 3 days. It's not gone well. These are the things I'm struggling with. I want to get it back on track. What can I do? And so, of course, you know, we went through some strategies, and to those athletes' credit, they were able to get back on track with those strategies. But for the majority of people, that's not going to work, right? Like, having a half an hour conversation and then doing, you know, 15 minutes of mindfulness, thinking about our goals and values, and then being really clear on our race cues. You're not going to be able to do that in half an hour. And a lot of people don't even know what their race cues are, or their goals, which I think is really interesting. Most people would assume that athletes are really clear. And when we ask from a psych perspective, they go, yeah, actually, I don't know. Right.
No.
Right. Yeah. Right. So actually, I don't know. Well, we need to know, because that's going to guide our behaviors, and it's going to guide how we interact with thoughts and emotions. So my answer to that question is, we go back 16 weeks and we have a plan. a plan for our mental skills that is the same way as your plan for developing your technique, for developing your race plan, for developing your race cues that are all linked in. So then the answer is, where do we start? First thing, it really depends on the individual. It depends, right? What are their barriers? What are the specific thoughts potentially that they're struggling with? What are the specific emotions potentially that they're struggling with? What are their goals and what are their values? What are barriers to attention at the moment? Are they someone who focuses too much on past performances? Is it worry about the future and not what's going on and what could happen, right? So all of those things need to be assessed. And so I think the first thing is that happens, number one, through conversation, but it also happens through testing, right? We have really clear data. Again, I just try to link everything back to physiology because we're really good at physiology. When you start a preparation, it's 2000 time trial, it's 1650s on 130, it's 1225. Like, we're really clear in our testing. How many pull-ups can we do? What do we actually have to focus on to get better? Performance psychology is the same, right? Where is it specifically? And for a lot of people, it's holistic, all right? So as an example, let's talk through if we had someone who, had multiple areas that they could work on. So the first thing for me, we're going to start with is awareness, all right? So are you truly aware of the thoughts and feelings that you're having and how they interact with behavior? All right. I'd say that's 50-50 for the people that we speak to. Some are very, very aware, and you would argue nearly hyper aware, right? And that's something that we definitely want to work through, because when we say, not focus on others is a key that we always hear in, but you absolutely can be too internally focused, right? So I often describe, and it's an oversimplification, thoughts and emotions as distractions themselves.
Absolutely.
Once it's time for performance, it's what do I need to be doing, and I should be there, right? And I often kind of use the metaphor of a math test. If, we were looking out the window instead of looking at the math questions, we wouldn't expect to do well, right? And it's the same way with our thoughts and our emotions. So if we were looking out the window at our thoughts and emotions, which is kind of where they are, they're just this thing, right? Instead of the key things that I need to do, it's no surprise that we kind of finish an event and go, what happened? Right. And so the other 50% is often, the first time I speak to someone, I say, hey, tell me what we're feeling pre-race. Tell me what the specific thought, and I mean, tell me specifically what the thoughts are, right? And they'll go, I don't know. I know it doesn't feel good. I know it's not working. They can tell me after they've had a poor event very specifically and clearly what's happening, right? Which is normal because we attach and remember very emotive states and responses better, right? But the first thing is we need to be able to recognize, observe, and describe what's happening. Okay. From there, then it's, for me, the next one is attention. All right. So are we able to, no matter what's going on internally or externally, keep our focus where it needs to be? And where it needs to be is, again, individually defined. Right? For the most part, we would kind of call that in psychology, what are the task-specific attention that we need? All right. But again, for some, that might be, 3 cues, 3 technical cues, right? Which is kind of the general way that we will work, but it is very individual. But learning the skill to move, because your attention, particularly in, moments that matter, will get drawn, right? It will get drawn to thoughts. It will absolutely get drawn to emotions because the situation matters. And it can get drawn to a whole bunch of different areas. So we kind of call that, broadly as over some our distractions. It will get, when it does, and I think the first thing for us to understand is it's not a negative that it does. It will. Like, you will get drawn to some degree to those things. It's about, are you able to bring it back? Have you worked your attention skills to go, hey, I see that, it's there, it's okay, I can leave it there and come back to what's important. Right? Because we definitely don't want the idea of, I should never feel this, I should never think this, right? No, everybody does. It's what we do with it. Okay. From there, then we can kind of start delving into a little bit more of the really hard cognitive, which is, do I have thoughts I start with, but sometimes emotions that really drive my behaviors, right? If we do, We don't want to, right? Right? It's that kind of simple. So do we have a thought? And a very simple one is, I can't do this. This is too hard. Things that are things that are absolute truths. So the way that you speak to yourself, and they're often automatic. I think this is a big thing in sport. We often speak to people, and they use the term self-talk. Like, what is our self-talk, and how to
Yeah.
self-talk is a really inefficient strategy, right? Like we've just said, if our goal is to focus on performance cues, why are we focusing so much energy on changing these thoughts that are actually normal? Right?
Yeah.
Just let them be there. They're fine. You're a human, and it's all good. Just come back to what we need to do. But we want to make sure that we use the term diffusing or decoupling from thoughts and emotions, right? So they're not driving our behavior, right? The idea of, I can't do this, this is too hard. They're just simple versions. But what is driving my behavior is goals and values, right? Which would be the next thing. Once we've started to decouple and we've started to break that relationship between some of our thoughts and emotions, then we can start to go, hey, what really clearly are our goals? And we never want to move away purely from outcomes. We often hear the process versus outcome focused debate, and process is
Yeah.
where it's at, right? And it is, right? And because the simple is, the processes will get us to the outcome, right? But we're not trying to, particularly from an elite sport environment, we're not trying to say the outcome's not important. That's where psychology gets lost a little bit, and people start to go, oh, this is just fluff, right? Because at an Olympics, we're there to win,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right, we're there to win. We didn't train, or Olympic trials coming up in a few months for a lot of sports. We didn't train for the last 4.5 years now to not make this team.
Yeah.
But it's, where is our attention and our energy best served for that to happen, right? And it's not on the outcome. The outcome is going to increase the distractions that we feel, the thoughts and emotions and potential worries and all of those things. It is the processes, right? And so a big part of being able to anchor to that in those tough moments is values, knowing who you are and who you want to be, right? So again, speak to most athletes, and I'm sure you know yourself, is how much have we actually reflected on that? How clear are we really on that, right? For a lot of people, they've never thought about that.
Mm.
And that becomes your driving anchor, all right? From there, then we start to go, well, if these are the things that are really important to us, which starts to get to the essence of kind of toughness and resilience a little bit, is if this is who we want to be and this is what's important to us, are we able to do the things that are aligned to that no matter what's going on? Right? So no matter the emotion, no matter the thoughts, no matter distractions, external, whatever's going on, are we able to do that? The only way to do that is to accept that difficult things will happen.
Yeah.
So in pursuit of this, right? In pursuit of this person that I want to be and these goals that I want to achieve, there will be tough situations, whether that's thoughts, some form of doubt, whatever that may be, whether that's emotions, somewhat anxiety, right? Fear of failure, embarrassment, shame are all things that come up pretty consistently. I even throw in physical sensations because I like it as a juxtaposition, right? Everybody knows it's like, hey, I'm going to have to go through some fatigue.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't want to think about our thoughts and emotions like that. Right? But it's the same. It's like, hey, you're going to have these things that are uncomfortable, accept them as normal, and then move through. Where you start to get issues is when people try to control those things. When people go, I shouldn't feel that. I shouldn't think that. I can't perform when I have that. Right? Which is not the case. And that's the idea of worry about worry, and the distress actually comes from that. Right? And it can snowball and go downhill. Really, from there, we kind of get to our last point, which is identity, right? And we kind of spoke about this a little bit earlier, is, can I be, it's really contextual, right? We never want to have this view of ourselves as this is who I am no matter what, right? It's this is who I am or who I want to be. And then what is the best response based on the situation? And that's often where it is super valuable to talk to a psychologist and just talk it through and be able to, hey, this situation is new. This situation is different. This situation is bringing up these feelings. how do we work through this? What would it look like, right? To be able to do that on your own is tough. So in essence, we would have a plan over 16 to 20 weeks to address all of those things. All right. And if you kind of circle back, it's simple strategies, but that aren't easy, right? So if we talk about attention and awareness, that's kind of sitting in the mindfulness space, right?
Yeah.
So are we engaging in mindfulness practice? How are we doing it? How are we doing it specifically to you? What are we building? We know that 15 to 30 minutes is kind of the sweet spot. 15 minutes being the minimum effective dose, 30 minutes kind of being the maximum. So again, in elite sport, we're going to often find, number one, I don't use the word mindfulness. It's a dirty word. We don't like it, right? It's kind of the fluff. But if we say we want to develop attention and awareness skills, everybody goes, wow, that sounds like exactly what I need,
Yeah.
right? It's the same thing. But doing it in a way, again, that is specific to performance, making it contextual. All right. So once we're getting some basic development through, recordings, and we kind of do that progressively, listening and doing our normal meditation, then we need to be taking that to training. Right. So can we start to do it in warm-ups? Can we start to do it in main sets? Can we start to do it? Can we start to recognize our thoughts and emotions and pull ourselves back? Right. So it needs to be linked in. Same deal with, we discussed a little bit, decoupling and diffusion. To begin with, that's a really hard process, like any skill development. You're going to probably have to come away from a session and go, hey, what thoughts what thoughts got in the way today? And you're going to have to write them down, and you're going to have to then kind of work through a process of how can I respond differently? I can't do this, and I immediately stopped. And stopped could mean a bunch of different things, right? It could mean I actually just stopped the session, which is if that's happening, generally I'm probably already working with you because coach isn't happy, right? Right? Is kind of how it goes. Or it could be like I took my foot off the pedal, right? And I knew I took my foot off the pedal, right? So how do we make sure that there's a decision in there about what we're going to, because sometimes, right, here we go, like I can't do this because I have a shoulder niggle or because I have worked hard for the last 3 weeks and I am starting to get somewhat chronically fatigued, right? Sometimes the decision is to recover, but we want it to be a decision, right? We don't want our thoughts to just be guiding our behaviors.
Yeah.
From there, goals and values take a lot of work, take a lot of refinement. That's a never ending, touching base and finding ways. Some of the things recently that have been really helpful is working through them with athletes and then finding ways that they can reattach to them in hard moments. So it might be having them as initials on a drink bottle, right? It might be having them on a pool buoy. It might be including them in your 5 minutes of mindfulness practice before something begins, but just reminding yourself when it's tough, right? Because you tend to get that, I describe it as a fog, right? When that fatigue is really high and things really matter, you get a bit of a fog that makes it difficult for you to focus on what's important. And then you kind of come out of it and you're like, I knew I should have thought about my goals and values, right? And in a sport perspective, we want to say, we don't want to get to the end of the meet or the end of a session and be like, damn, I missed an opportunity there.
Yeah.
We want you present in the moment so you can make the best decision. In terms of then kind of emotional responses, it's very similar. That's talking through and decoupling and diffusing. I'd say what's attached to that is then really we pick out based on your goals and values, what are the 3 behaviors that must happen? All right. And so for individuals, it could be as broad as, I need to be turning up to training on time, right? Or I need to be doing whatever. And it can be, as granular as I need to be willing to accept, these difficult thoughts and emotions in this specific time. So it might be a specific session or it might be a specific meet. And so just having that frame coming in, it's like, hey, I'm expecting this. This is okay. And I've said to myself that I'm committing to learning how to deal and respond to this. And I have practiced it through the other things that we've just discussed. Gives you the ability to then really key in on that behavior. Because from a performance perspective, and I'd even argue from a mental health perspective, the rubber hits the road at behaviors, right? We often talk about thoughts and emotions in psychology, which are of course important, but the best responses come from behavior change.
Yeah.
Which are often the hardest responses too, right? But if you're taking behaviors that create positive emotions for you because they're aligned to who you want to be, you're generally working towards a better version of yourself holistically, right? Most strategies, that's where we're trying to get to. So I suppose that would be the 16 kind of the 20 we're building up to that. And then what does it look like at meet? Well, it looks like what are the strategies that are most important to you, right? And it looks like potentially a little bit of a taper as well. So if you've been doing some really good 20 minutes of mindfulness practice, maybe you just need a 5-minute recording that we've built for you pre-warm up to get you started. You've already got your goals and values on your water bottle. So as you're going through warm up, if things aren't going that well, you've got your anchor, right? As you're going through warm up, maybe you're not feeling the best, because we all have this idea that we'll come through taper and we'll magically feel the greatest we've ever felt, right? And this comes back to the idea that doesn't happen, that
Yeah.
space doesn't exist. So expecting that it does starts to lead us to failure. But we've already set up that we're going to go through this no matter what, no matter the thoughts, no matter the emotions. We've already performed in training regardless of that. So we're set up to be able to do that, being really clear on our cues. So as we start to move through marshalling, now we can go, hey, I can actually take 3 deep breaths, refocus on what I need to focus on, and then go and execute. Right? As I'm executing, even still, we can get so granular, my thoughts may get drawn to my competitors, right? That's not unrealistic, right? As I'm in the race, as I'm going through the 200 free, right? Can I recognize, which comes back to our first strategy, can I recognize that in the moment and bring myself back? All right. So there, I suppose that would be a real kind of 20-week, 16-week preparation of how it would come together and how you would utilize those skills. And for the most part, people that engage in that do see, really strong improvements, what I think is important. So that's both subjective in terms of how they feel, how confident they feel, performance, definitely from others. So a lot of the time we hear from coaches, they're nearly a different person. Like, I can't believe how relaxed they are. We've had a fair few coaches recently who have said, I can't believe the change in this athlete. I actually want to engage in this as a coach, because coaches go through all those emotions at a meet too, right?
Yeah.
How do I not ride that roller coaster? And then, of course, what I think is really important to our profession is hard data that shows improvement, right? Because it's important that it's not fluff, right? We need to be able to show that. So again, super long answer to what strategies could we use, but I think it's important to understand there are a number and they differ individually, but it's a process. It's training our mental skills the same way we train everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And you spoke about goals and values and, I guess, identity in that too. How do you think identity relates to sport, and how do you think that then comes across through injury and then even more so into retirement?
Yeah, really good question. And one, again, we deal with a fair bit. So I suppose identity, probably further to the point we made earlier, is it's always develops to a degree from our life experiences, right? So there will always be a component. Sport then, of course, is a very specific environment. So it makes sense that we kind of see reasonably similar sets of beliefs and sets of identities that people develop. And so we kind of mentioned a few earlier, which is, this idea of unrelenting standards and strong rule following. Admiration seeking and recognition seeking is one very clearly. We will often see, definitely on a kind of a second tier, on a less, emotional inhibition, and people not wanting to share emotion. And again, all of those things, they're fascinating, and I don't have a specific answer to this point. All I can say is that all of those things, if you empathize with an athlete, you can see how they've developed and why they would actually be important for their performance, right? And I think that's so important. Sometimes in psychology, we've just come in and go, you're wrong, you should think differently, right? And it's not the case, right? That set of thoughts and beliefs and that serves a purpose, right? But it's about just being able to understand then in a different context, maybe it doesn't serve, right? And this now comes to the idea of career transition. So then what is the next set of thought patterns and behaviors that are going to serve me better in this environment or another environment? So it's a really difficult question, because absolutely, right, there is a identity, that athletes develop. I think there's a strong argument that we're not trying to say that we shouldn't develop that identity? It will be. There will always be, to a degree, some. It doesn't matter who you are, what context, you will create some level of belief, some level of the way you see the world based on that, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think it's important to say that that is reflective of your situation. But how do we start to challenge that a little bit to a degree? I think often it comes for me, and we'll often see some big changes in identity in actually all of the other things we already discussed, right? So if you start to become more aware of, when are these rules and standards not working for me, right? And we get to that a lot of times straight away with athletes who go, I need to leave for the meet at 9 o'clock. If it's 9:01, I'm not going to race well,
Yeah.
right? And we go, and as soon as they say it, they go, yeah, that's not going to work, right? And it's not going to work post swimming, and it's not going to work. And being able to just have these conversations and process it starts to break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that I particularly notice through lockdown. It's like, okay, well, I can't swim.
Yeah.
So who am I without my swimming? Like I'm still, I'm still me, but who is that me if I don't have swimming?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to, and for you, I don't know how much you want to share. I'd love to hear, like, what was that thought process like? Like, talk, who is me? What did you get to?
Oh, I'm still figuring it out now. I still don't think I've got an answer, and I don't know if there is, just a one fits all answer. There's not. It's going to continue to develop over time.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a hard question, and it's a hard thing to ponder, especially when you have so much time to yourself and that's all you have to do. Like you just spend so much time thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's hard. And being injured as well, you kind of feel like, I mean, you have to pull back to an extent. You have to let your body recover, and you have to pull back. You can't do the same as what you're doing before. You are restricted. So it's a matter of finding a different way to go about it, resetting those expectations, resetting those goals to make sure that you can still progress, but in a different way.
Yes. And there's so many interesting things you said. Firstly, that I'm still working through 100%. You never stop that, right? As you said, but I would even go a step further in there's no singular you.
Yeah.
Right. There's multiple. Depending on the situation and context. But that is a thing that we would definitely argue is important to knuckle down and put that hard work into. And it sounds like you have a little, like you've put that thought process in and you've started to really think about it. A lot of people, that's a natural thing, which a lot of people don't do that, right? They never. And that's where, those kind of just these natural reactions start to come up, right? And then in terms of, resetting expectations, again, you can see, if we've developed this belief that, hey, no matter what, I hit this training that I need to hit, that's important for me to get to where I want to get, super adaptive, right? Now, until I have an injury, and now I have to reset expectations and I don't like it. And that in itself creates anxiety and stress because I'm so attached to that, right?
Yeah.
And being able to just work through and break those things down, super important.
Yeah, and it's hard. And
Oh, yeah.
like there's no doubt about that. It's hard, and sometimes it sucks. Like it's just not a fun time.
No, I think you're right. And I would even argue that's probably the first thing that we would say to people when they come in is like, hey, this isn't going to be just a bit of chit chat and you leave feeling better, right? This is hard work. This is the same hard work, that if you want to, have a certain amount of physiology, if you want to be able to respond to lactate, you want to be strong, you want to have an aerobic base, all of those things, how hard they're going to be. Developing your mental skills is going to be just as hard. We'll develop a plan and we'll walk you through it. And we'll provide that support at every stage, but you better be ready to put that hard work in and be deep, dark, and honest with yourself, right?
Yeah, and I've definitely noticed that through different sessions. Sometimes I walk out of speaking with my psych, and sometimes I do feel like there's a weight lifted off my shoulders, and you do feel that sense of relief. And then other times you go out and you're like, damn, that was really hard today. And you just need a day to just not do anything because you're just mentally tired.
Yeah, exactly. You're 100% right. I'd love for you, when you walk out and you feel that relief, what do you think that comes from? What do you think that process is?
Well, for me, something that I've done for a long time, and before I started speaking to a psych, I bottle things up. That was my way of dealing with things, is I'll just bottle up, not talk about it, it'll be fine, I'll get over it. So I think just being able to share it with someone else is a relief.
Yep, 100%. It's exactly that, right? It's taking it off your shoulders. And so that is a strategy that we haven't discussed, but the strategy of just processing is so effective, right?
Yeah.
And so talking to someone is great. Kind of as we've said, there's a stigma and some people really don't want to do that. Does that mean you still can't get that benefit? No, that's where things like journaling come in, right? And diarying and writing down. So if people are listening and it's like, hey, I can hear the benefits and I'd like to get involved, but I still don't want to take that step. There's some pre-steps you can
Yeah.
take, right? Further to I think to your question about what can you do on race day, this is, that idea of processing. Often we'll schedule calls. They'll kind of be 15 to 30 minutes with athletes, and it might be kind of every day of a meet, the day before, kind of key periods for them. And it's just to let them do that. There is no
Yeah.
strategy. There is nothing. It's just whatever's been swirling, just get it out. Just have a chat and you generally will feel better.
Yeah, I definitely find that. And something that one of my friends said, and I loved it. And I was like, where'd you get that from? She goes, Shrek. And I was like, oh my God. But she goes, a problem shared is a problem halved.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I love that. Yeah, I'll probably
Yeah.
use that in the future. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
But I said to him, like, where's that from? She goes, Shrek. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So going back to like anxiety and things like, how do you define mental illness, and what do you think is like, what do you see most common in athletes, and obviously particularly in swimming?
Yeah. Super great question. I suppose, again, I'm answering all of them as such a classic psychologist, which I don't really like, but I would say there is no traditional, right? There is no, this is what we see. And I don't think that also there is, this is what anxiety looks like, right? Or this is what depression looks like, or this is what a stress response looks like. It can be very different. And I think that's important. And it comes back to a little bit of our awareness piece and being aware of what that is for you, right? In terms of what we see most common, again, it really links to that point of, I have seen everything from trauma, right, which is all the way on the far end, to year 12 stress, right? Is kind of the I
Yeah.
don't want to dismiss that, but it's much smaller in the grand scheme of some other things. And so it comes back to the point we made earlier for me, is that athletes, no matter how many things they do well mentally and the strength that they have and the commitment and the self-discipline, are still people like everybody else. And so that, what does it look like? I always kind of say it looks like what the general population standard is, right? So if mental health is in that kind of 30% area, it's generally kind of what we see, at least in practice and in clinic from a psych perspective. And I think that's always an interesting challenge back to coaches to say, hey, if you've got, 12 athletes, or 9 to 12 athletes, there's a chance that 3 of them are struggling, right? And you put it in that perspective, it's like, well, maybe, I think often coaches would be like, maybe I'll have 1 or 2 in my whole career, right?
No.
Yeah, exactly, right. And that's the idea, that it is still quite hidden, and it is still quite, but it is absolutely no different. And I think a lot of people would even make the argument that it's slightly higher in sport, right? Because some of the things we've spoken about, the social medias, the pressures, the negativity that you can have to deal with. So you do have to be very good on your mental skills, because the life stresses are higher, right?
Yeah.
But I think the way that I funnel it back is, as always, put anybody into someone's shoes with a certain set of life stresses, and more than likely you would get the same response, right?
Yeah, definitely. So how would you say, like, if for a coach or even another squad member, if like, what would you say the warning signs are? Like, if you can see someone struggling, what does that look like, and when do you think is a good time to step in and say something, and just say, hey, I've noticed some changes, are you okay?
Yeah, really, again, really difficult question, because again, it will depend on the individual, right? Like how
Absolutely.
the individual presents, normally. I think change is just a good indicator. When someone is changed from their normal demeanor, something is going on. It might be small, it might be big, right? And so you can kind of, is it our normal, we're a little more snappy today? Is it we're a little more reserved? Is it behavior change? Not quite committing to things as much as we used to? Is it, removing a little bit from, the social gatherings that we used to do? Is it physical fatigue? I think is a big one, and is hard to to pick up in sport because there's kind of an expectation that there is already physical fatigue,
Yeah.
right? But what is the driver of excessive fatigue? There is a lot, obviously, just, I hate to use the term attitude, but just attitudinal changes to a degree, are all things to be aware of. How do you then have that discussion? I think is, one of the reasons links back to the benefits of being proactive in psychology is we can then start to have those conversations and debriefs as a team led by a psychologist.
Yep.
Right. But that's very hard if you haven't got a pre-relationship
Yeah.
with an athlete, right? That's the assumption is that you already have a really, really good relationship with this, but which we know, right? Let's say in swimming, if you're there's potentially 40 people in your squad,
Yeah.
so it's potential that you're not going to have a great relationship with everybody. And so that's hard. But I would say, and I think it comes back to this idea of being able to empathize with others, is if you do notice, right, definitely take that step to say, hey, what's going on? Is there anything I can do? Recognize that, you may get a response, and a very honest and truthful response, and then we can provide support and offer help. You may also not, right?
Yeah.
And I just think the context to come at it from that perspective is just understand, right?
Yeah.
That person now knows that you're there, right? If things change and it progresses worse, they know at least one person has noticed and they could potentially reach back out. But I would say don't be afraid to ask how people are doing because you're scared of getting that, that bite back response.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think it's always different, if, you rewind 5 years to me, if someone had asked how you're going, my standard response is, yeah, I'm fine.
Of course.
I'm not going to unload all my problems on someone that's just asked me. It's hard to be honest and, let yourself be vulnerable. But if someone does feel comfortable in opening up to you, how do you then provide that support? Like, obviously, it's important to let them know that you're here, that you're available for support, and that you're ready to listen. When, how do you continue providing that support, and when do you say, okay, I think things are a little more serious than first anticipated, how do I suggest that something else needs to be done?
Yeah, really good question. I would say two things. I would say number one is listening, and then questions. And I think behavior, because in essence what we're talking about in help seeking behaviors, again, is a behavior change itself, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to lead people to that, right? We can't tell them ever, right, over time. And so the first thing is, okay, I've offered, hey, are you okay? What's going on? I've noticed, and great, this person is willing to share, like we've just said. So just sitting there and listening to them is going to half their problem, right? In the words of Shrek, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And we don't need to solution. We don't need to do any of that, right? And even as a psychologist, I would definitely say that the biggest benefit that we provide at times is that, right? Is just knowing that someone's going to listen. From there, right, as you said, things are maybe a little more serious, right? And sometimes we don't always know where that line is. I think the first thing is don't hold yourself to that standard. We're not a trained professional, right? Which is okay. But the second thing is questioning. Once you kind of get to that spot where they have really told you what's going on and they've started to feel comfortable, I think it's then asking, hey, what's our next step here? And asking them, not telling ever, right? Like never, you need to see someone, or you need to, change X. This is one I see constantly is like, well, if you want to change, your circumstances, right? That's going to pull people away quickly. It's, hey, okay, so, we've just, you've told me everything that's going on. What do we think our next step is? And I wouldn't say that's the first conversation either. Right?
Yeah.
And to them, it could be, I don't know right now. That's okay. Change is a process. We'll still be there to listen and slowly build that ambivalence and that discrepancy. So build their desire to seek help, right?
Yeah.
Until it gets to a point where they go, hey, I find this really valuable, maybe I'd like to get a little more help, or maybe some specialized help, or maybe, and that could be in levels. It could be, maybe it's a parent first, maybe it's a coach second, right? Maybe then it's then finding out how I can get psychological support. So I think the first is listen. I think the second is question to help build those help seeking behaviors. And then I think third and fourth is understand that, we're not a trained professional and we're not meant to have all the answers.
Yep.
But at the same time, what are you doing if you are a supporter or a caregiver, let's say, going to that extreme end, what are you doing for yourself as well? Right. So you may need to speak to someone, right?
Yeah.
Also, if they're speaking to someone, and again, that could be a friend or it could be a psychologist, but the supporter often needs just as much support. So that would be a thing I would keep in
Absolutely.
mind.
I think that's a really big thing that's missed. And I think, we see it a lot. If you think about like the elderly,
Mm,
they generally have a caregiver, and there is financial support or other resources available for the caregiver. I don't think that is seen in mental health.
no, you're 100% right. And I know at an industry level, it's something that we're trying to do better. And there's a lot of research at the moment, particularly about that. And let's say we have someone come in, maybe it's suicide. Right? Maybe it's someone has attempted to take their life, and of course there are the immediate acute interventions and strategies that need to take place to support that person and provide the support they need, right? But it has slipped through the cracks a little bit. What happens for family? What happens for friends? And how do we make sure that they're also getting the support that they need, right? And so that's being looked at closely. I know a lot of people are doing a good job with that now, and considering that. Of course, it seems, when we say it, so logical, right? It seems so
Yeah.
easy, but you can imagine, right? You're dealing with someone you just want to provide, any support service. It could be, nurse, doctor, psychologist, anyone. You just want to provide the best. It's so easy. We've just talked about performance, to lose sight of all those other things. And so I agree that it's something we're trying to do better at. And so what I would suggest to people is that if you are in that situation, I suppose take a little bit of accountability and say, hey, I need help too.
Yeah. I think it's a massive thing. And I know in the Surrey Park community, we lost one of our own through suicide, and there was those resources available
Mm,
post passing,
yep.
but that wasn't. And I mean, obviously what happens behind closed doors, people don't always know what's going on.
Mm.
But I don't know if there's enough support like whilst things are going on. It always tends to be after. It's always a cure, never a prevention.
Yeah, right. It links back to our initial discussion about proactive, right? And,
Yeah.
and it being there. And I agree. And it's exactly like you said. Unfortunately, based on each kind of situation, you don't know, right? I kind of always say in psychology, you don't know until you know. People often, again, I'll have coaches come up to me on pool deck or around and say, "Hey, this is blah 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 blah. What's wrong? What do we do?" So there is a lot more information we need to know before we get anywhere into that, right? And even if there was, I'm not sharing it with you. Is kind of the other thing, right? Because
Yeah.
of course it's confidential. But yeah, you're right. That's a really difficult situation when, as I said earlier, that's the classic psych response at the moment, which hurts my heart a little bit. Is once it's all happened, now we respond, now we react.
Yeah.
I'd definitely like to get us to a place where we're being proactive in that, particularly in the sporting community.
Yeah. So going on proactive, what are the things that we can implement at training? Like, let's say, you're talking to a coaches at a club. What kind of things do you recommend should be done? We at Surrey Park have, at least 15 minutes activation prehab
Mm,
before we even get in
yep.
the pool. What are some things that we can include in that?
Yeah, so there's a lot, and you can be really creative with it. I would say, start small. And it's hard, I suppose, when you throw it out and you still haven't, I suppose people haven't seen it. But let's say, could 5 minutes of dedicated mindfulness be included at the start of those 15-minute activations? Like, there's really absolutely no reason, right?
Yeah.
But what's really important with introducing those changes is that the vision and purpose is really clear, right?
Yeah.
You know yourself, right? So it's at SP, we do our 15-minute activation. How meaningful is a lot of that 15-minute activation?
Well, how productive is it for everybody?
Yeah, right. So, and that's going to shift and move, right?
Yeah.
Depending. And so, and now imagine, you think about the athletes and I go, hey, now we're going to sit down quiet for 5 minutes, earphones in, and do this little meditation practice. How long is that going to last? Maybe 3 days, right?
Yeah.
Before it drops off. So there's a process, I think, and that's where, we do need to have psychologists engaged to be able to make it meaningful for people. right? So those meditations are like, stuff like Headspace is great. Don't get me wrong. Please don't understand what I'm saying. Don't use Headspace and a bunch of these meditation apps. But for them to be most effective, they need to be tailored to you, right?
Yeah.
What are the actual thoughts that you're dealing with, and how do we play those into the recording? What are the emotions, or to the group, right? Or to a sport context, right? They can't be too general. So that I would say we can start there, and that can change. And there are some really creative, even team-based exercises that you can do for mindfulness. One that I kind of really like is maybe you pair up in twos and you pick an object, in your view, and you describe that object as deeply as you can. And you keep going. We say we'll go for 2 minutes or 2 minutes 30, right? And what happens pretty quickly at about the 30-second mark is you start to get in your own head. Hey, I don't know if I can say anymore here. What's this person thinks I'm awkward, right? Like you start to those
Yeah.
distractions. Now, again, the way we describe it is they're not the same distractions as, potentially the performance anxiety that you would feel, right? But it's the same mechanism of leaving those to the side and bringing your attention back to where it needs to be. Right. And so you can have one person do it, the other person do it, provide feedback. It's very easy to see when someone's getting stuck in their own head. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of different things you can do. You can make that really hard if you really want to kind of, the idea of being progressive on your mental skills and being able to do them you can make people firstly have to do it. And then secondly, they have to do it maintaining eye contact. Right. So you can imagine then the emotion that starts to build with that, right? Like this is very uncomfortable, right? But performance is going to be uncomfortable. So there's some simple things, right? Again, can we leave? I think you only have to do this even 3 times a week, maybe. Can we leave 5 or 10 minutes to write down some of the thoughts that really got in the way of performance and how I would handle them differently, right? Such a critical strategy that allows you to be better prepared next week when that thought comes back up, right? It's a process, Again, definitely some of the best programs I work with do clear goal setting.
Yeah.
Right. The majority don't. Right. But that needs to go a step further. Where is the value component of that? And then how are we re-engaging with that on a daily basis? Right. So again, all of those things can come into that. Maybe that 15 minutes, you don't need a full 15 minutes to do it once they've been developed. Maybe it's, I would say, a workshop twice a season, beginning of the season, middle of the season, and then maybe it's just once a week. Right. And then other than potentially training diary, where you're self-reflecting on your ability to link to the things that are important. So to put it in perspective, when I say values, most people will say, a lot of the first question we'll ask people to start to develop this is, how do you want to be remembered as an athlete? And eventually you can do that as, how do you want to be remembered as a person? And you can build into it, right? And most people will say, I want to be a hard worker. I want to get the best out of myself. I want to be a good teammate. Our very kind of general, I don't want to say general as in not meaningful, but general responses, right?
Yeah.
And so to simply reflect back each day and go, or even in the moment, which is even better, am I being that person right now?
Yeah.
Am I working to that level? And that's completely between you and you, right? Right? Am I being the best teammate right now? Like, I had a shit day. That's okay, right? But is that driving the type of teammate that I am right now? Right?
Yeah.
Because it shouldn't, right? And so those are easy strategies to implement. So I think all of those little things are effective, but also I think within session, the next step is then, hey, most people I can, whether it's running, triathlon, swimming, even, netball we've worked with, rugby, AFL, will have some level of, I'll say, easy warm-up. So in swimming, it might be, hey, let's start 400 easy. Right,
Yeah.
600 easy. In netball, it might be, hey, a couple shooting drills, whatever it might be, right? How are we then going, all right, just swimming is our biggest sport, how do we then make sure we're mindful and present for that first 400, right? So actually taking those skills that you're working with and applying them directly to the sport, all right? What are the things you should be focusing on? Can I feel the water differently? Where is my attention? Is it on the pour session that I had this morning? Is it on the soreness that I feel in the middle of the preparation? What is it? And where should it be? And we'll often get, as athletes start to do that, go, well, hey, I actually felt really poor. And very quickly, I felt the shift in technique. All of a sudden
Yeah.
I'm higher in the water, and I'm all of these things that I didn't think could change just from changing where I put my attention. Right. And again, I'd say gradually over time, then it's about building those into the toughest main sets. Right? The same way we build everything. Can you gradually over time build those skills in the toughest main set? So there's a lot in saying all of those skills. Is it workshops once a month with a psychologist? That could be 60 minutes at the end of a Saturday morning session, end of a week, to firstly teach those skills, right? Make them important, create the vision, and then just check in, right? And then leave you guys to develop it as you need to and build it into your own. I think the ability to be creative, as always, so whether that's, physiology and S&C is a good example. There's so many different ways you can creatively load the body to get the response that you want, right? And we're really good at that. Mental skills is the same way. Once we know the underlying mechanism that we're trying to get to build it into the training environment is actually quite fun. Like, there's so many different ways we can do it. It's kind of endless, but those, I would say, are some basic fundamentals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know something that my school particularly did during lockdown. We did Zoom, I think, just like everybody else in the world during lockdown. And one of the techniques we tried was visualization of racing and things like that. And that was really interesting. And we did some goal setting and things like that too. So going on self-reflection, how important is it to, we've set goals, then I think a lot of people, we just forget about it. Like, yep, goals written down, yep, move on. And I think too in sport is we're always so focused on what's next that we don't take a moment to step back and think about what we're doing right now. Like, you finish a race, you've got to finish one race, you did really well, but you don't actually think about that because you're thinking about the next race. You've already moved on to the next thing.
Absolutely. I think, and this is the idea of goal setting. And I would say then the difference between effective goal setting, right? But also the value link, right? So for me, you have your goal. It can be as specific or as broad really as you want it to be. I don't think personally, because the goal itself is not actually critically important. It's as you've just described, right? It's the things that sit underneath that. For me, then it's got to be a really clear link to the value, right? Which value have I identified? What type of person I want to be is linked to this. Right? So hard work is a classic one, right? So if I want to go a 57.500 back, let's just say, I know that I'm going to have to put in a certain amount of hard work to be able to do that. So there's a clear value link. Then what are the behaviors that sit underneath that? Right. And so there might be some clear situations that are barriers at the moment, right? So there's some things that it's like, hey, I really don't like a specific type of work or at a specific time or whatever it may be. We all kind of know that. Maybe it's aerobic work, maybe it's Saturday morning, maybe it's kick pull, whatever it is. Like, I have this tendency to shy away from it because I don't like it.
Yeah.
Linking that really clearly to that value and really clearly to that goal, and then having it really clearly stated. We call it really a commitment schedule, right? When that moment came, what did I do? Right. And so one of the things I think is important in that is we have a tendency to systematically undervalue how much positivity we gain from doing those things. Right. So we'll often think about, let's say I avoid a situation that I don't like. It could be aerobic work, and you could take this into any aspect of life. Maybe it's a social setting. Maybe I'm just not doing that well, and so I avoid a situation, right? I kind of know straight away when I avoid it that I'm going to feel better because it's going to remove that discomfort, that uncomfortable feeling, right?
Yeah.
We don't think about the long-term negative of what avoiding that is going to create, right? We're not good at that. When it comes to behavior, we do the opposite, right? So when it comes to behavior, we know long-term the benefit. We're really clear. The example I'll often give to people is a diet. Right? It's like, hey, I'm on a diet, which you shouldn't be necessarily. We won't talk about it necessarily, right? But hey, I'm on this diet, I'm on this, whatever it may be. Body composition is important, but I'm on this diet, or I'm trying to eat better, whatever that means for you, right? I know if I come home from a tough day on Friday and smash this liter of ice cream, it's not going to be the best for me right now. So it's the opposite. Or it is going to be great for me right now, but I know it's not going to be the best for me down the road.
Yeah.
All right. What we tend to do if we swip that is like, hey, if I actually, cook the meal that I plan to cook and do the things that I plan to do, we're not good at recognizing how good we will feel after that,
Yeah.
right? From going through that and being like, hey, I did what I wanted to do. I stuck to it. I said it. So we really do undervalue those things. And I think to that point is where it comes back to then, as you said, making sure we celebrate the small wins, right? So we've identified this situation it could be a barrier, or it could just be something that, hey, I need to take this to the next level to perform, right? Every time it comes up, I'm recording what it was, right? What day it was, what my thought and emotions were around it. You can then self-reflect on what you did with those thoughts and emotions, right? We kind of talked about some strategies today. And then I'm writing out of 10, how good did I feel after it? Right. And most of the time, it's like if I did what I said I was going to commit to, linked to my goals and values, I'm like an 8 out of 10 positive, right? Or I'm a 7 out of 10. And taking that reflection and going, holy shit, yeah, I feel good, right? But if we don't take the time to actually start that self-reflection, we don't recognize it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you said, we go on to the next. Now, over time, I would say it doesn't take that long. In our experience, if you do that for, a week, 2 weeks in a sporting setting, most people then start to do it naturally. Like they'll start to get out of the session and be like, yeah, I got that one. Right.
Yeah.
They start, but it's as with any skill development, it's hard at the beginning and becomes more automatic.
Yeah. And I think, I've had a few coaches over the years, and even different clubs. I think it's definitely something both athletes and coaches skip over quite a lot, particularly at meets and comps. Yeah, cool, this race is done. We're gonna have to think about the next one now. Like we need to move on. Like we're very quick to move on to the next thing. Everything just seems a bit rushed. We don't take a moment to say, hey, okay, we actually did this well. Let's take a moment to celebrate that before we go on to the next thing.
Yeah, I love that. And that's even at a bigger level than what we just described, which I love. What do you think that is? If I throw back to you, where do you think that comes from?
Oh, I mean, I think that comes in not even just in sport. I think we all seem to be in such a rush to get things done, and we just don't take a moment to appreciate what we've achieved to get to that point. At some point, if you go back, you wished you had achieved what you have right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
At some point, that's what you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what you wanted. Now that you've done it, now you go on to the next thing. It's like, whoa, hang on a second.
Yeah.
Take a step back. A few years ago, this is exactly where you wanted to be, and you haven't even taken a moment to achieve that.
Yeah.
And even my friend, not through swimming, but through placement, she was saying, I spent, 3 years trying to get this degree, and I've allocated an hour to celebrate.
Yeah.
She goes, why have I done that?
Yeah.
I've allocated 1 hour to celebrate 3 years.
Yeah.
Because I've literally set aside that much time. She goes, what? Like, that seems ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm just going to then, allocate an hour and then move on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating. I think it comes to a lot of the things we spoke about. The idea is being present, right?
Yeah.
Are we present in this moment right now? If you are, you're good. Sometimes I'll oversimplify it again, because I've said before, I think it's so valuable. But most discomfort or distress comes in past or future, right? If I'm right here, right now, I'm generally good.
Yeah.
Right. Now, when people, as you were saying, are, excessively in the future, and then we start to see that we're rushing to the next, I'd say that's a mild anxiety response.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like, right? Is, hey, I'm rushing to look at this next thing. I've got so, right? Instead of just being right here and celebrating. Really tough thing. And I think it's one of those ones in particular that in psychology, again, gets kind of thrown in this fluff basket if it's not managed appropriately. This idea of being present, like being present is so key, but it needs to be clearly linked to the situation and to the benefits to the individual. Often it's just kind of thrown. It's like, oh, we'll just think about being present and we'll be fine. And it's obviously not as easy as that, right? I think in the situation of your friend, which is even, again, the more complex component of psychology, you would have to think back to, and this comes back to goals and values. Often we see people, right? We get to this stage of this thing that we thought was important, but then was it actually important? Right. And that's where taking the time to know who we are and what is really important, and not have that be dictated to by outside distractions. And I say outside distractions, which are other people or comparisons or these belief structures that we've set up over time, or our thoughts or our emotions. Now they could still be the right thing, and we're still just rushing through, right? That was the one thing I wanted. But for a lot of people, definitely in sport, is we get to this moment and it's like, hey, why was this moment actually important to me?
Yeah.
And we got to have reflection. Again, comes back to my idea about being proactive, about it's never the thing that you gain, it's the person you become.
Mm.
That's the moment, right? That's the key takeaway from all achievement, right? So do we know the person that we're trying to become as we're getting to this thing?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also too, thinking about it even further, I mean, I see it, I don't know if other people do, like a stigma in the sense that if you celebrate something that you're good at, that you're almost seen as cocky.
Yep.
Um, but on the other hand, like even for me, like I won't do it because I don't want to be seen as cocky. But like, let's say you're my friend and assuming you've achieved this massive thing that you've been wanting to do for ages, I'm going to pump you up and get you excited and make sure
Yep.
that you celebrate. But I don't want to do the same if it was me.
Yeah. What do you think that is?
I don't know. I think, as I said, I think it's a stigma of coming across as cocky and self-absorbed. And yeah, I think that for me is probably the main thing.
Yeah. Perception of others is always a difficult thing to work through. And then the idea of, do others actually perceive us as cocky and arrogant because we do? Like, we actually don't know. I think that's a super important thing to understand. It's like, we actually think we're very good at knowing what other people think, and we actually are not, right?
No.
And being able to put that in perspective. But yeah, I'd agree. And I even had a conversation with someone earlier this week about this idea of, this athlete was super excited to race, which is something that's new for her. That some of the things that we've been struggling with, and she didn't want to admit that. Right? She's like, I don't want to say that I'm excited to race because there was potential expectations that came with that.
Yeah.
And there doesn't have to be. And these are some of the things that we thought. It's like, hey, we can just generally be happy to race and nothing more, and that's okay, right? And it doesn't mean it's going to be good or we're putting expectations with it. It's just this is where we are. But I think I agree. The ability to celebrate is something that the way I put it in sport is there's nearly become, and psychology is somewhat to blame for this, I think, that emotions are bad.
Yeah.
Both negative and positive, right? It's like we should be emotionally level all the time, and we're these robots that can just execute, right? And of course, that's not the way it is. It's always contextual, and the idea that we should be able to process and definitely show positive. And what I think is the most interesting, if we think about our favorite athletes and our favorite coaches, and they're never really, they're never robots. They're the most emotional. They're the ones really showing that emotion and that passion and that drive at the right time and in the right way, right? But it's never this idea that we just don't celebrate or we don't get disappointed, right?
Yeah, and that's something that my psychologist has spoken to me a lot about, is that emotions are not good or bad. You can't
yeah.
label an emotion as good or as bad because
No.
if someone that you love has passed, it's not bad that you're upset.
No.
That's normal.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be bad if you weren't upset, if we're
Exactly.
totally honest, right? No, I agree so much. And so I'll throw to this because I love the way, your psychologists are talking here, because I agree so much that there is how we attribute emotions is on us, right? It's our perception of. There are no good or bad emotions, right? But there are responses that are interesting. What's your kind of thoughts on that you've worked through with your psych?
Yeah, I agree. I think, as I said, there's no good or bad emotion. Some are more uncomfortable to sit with than others, and you may not want to feel that,
Yes.
but it doesn't mean it's bad or
No.
doesn't mean it's good.
No. And I would say the next step, I think, that we would really like to understand is what is then the response to the emotion. That's the key. The emotion itself, if you can get really, really great mental skills, the emotion itself is kind of nothing.
Yeah,
Right?
it's how
It's
you
there,
act.
it's a part of life, but it's the response to the
Yeah.
emotion. And again, it's not about a good or bad response, but it's about a response based on a situation and a context.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and what's our anchor point for that? Goals and values. Who do we want to be?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, there's been so many things in this chat. There's so many things to unpack. Is there anything else that you want to add in?
I don't think so. I think, yeah, we've had a really interesting conversation. Hopefully people take some value out of it. The only thing I suppose I would add, I'm probably sure you added some, as said, is, if you are looking for help, reach out. There are obviously, Beyond Blue, Lifeline, there's plenty of support. If you're interested in knowing more about performance psychology, you can definitely reach out to us. All right, so P3 Performance Psychology. We have social media, but our email is info@p3psychology.com. I'm sure we can probably link or do something with that.
Yeah, I'll put that in the notes.
And again, we're super responsive to just questions and emails, right? So don't feel like you have to make this commitment to seeing a psychology. That's not what we're about. If you give us a call and you kick us an email, we will give you some insight and we will give you some time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been so insightful.
Awesome. Thank you so much.